Hello everyone, thanks so much for checking in on how I made a beautiful solid walnut dining table. This was a table that I made for a friend of mine who also happens to be my boss as he's the principal at my school. So it was important to make it as perfect as I could so I didn't end up teaching kindergarten next year. Can you imagine? It'd be like herding cats. Anyways, like all of my table builds, I start by cutting the wood to rough length. I didn't have a lot of wiggle room in this one, so I cut all the pieces to 66 inches, leaving only about an inch of room to trim off later. This table is going to be 65 inches long, so all of the offcuts from this 8-foot lumber are going to be used to make the base. Once that's all cut, I go over and move to the jointer and face joint one face of the walnut. Next, I switch over to the planer and get it down to final thickness, which in this case was just over 1.25 inches thick. This new Laguna planer I got is so nice to work with. Working out of my garage, I always felt that it was bad running my old planer because it was so loud, but now this thing, I don't have to worry about that at all. When everything was down to the right thickness, I went back to the jointer and edge jointed one edge to give me a perfect 90 degrees to run against the table saw fence. And that was the next step, now to rip everything to final width. I'm sure some people are going to give me a hard time about wearing a glove on my left hand, but honestly, I keep it far away from the blade and it keeps the moneymakers away from any potential life-threatening slivers. I'm always careful to make sure that I keep my hand well back. With the boards laid out the way that I wanted them, I struck a few lines for some dominoes to add to the top to help keep things aligned during the glue up. For this size of table, I used 5 8mm by 50mm dominoes per joint. The same results could be obtained with a dowel jig or biscuit joiner. When the mortises are cut, I can move on to the glue up. I let the tabletop sit in the clamps for a couple hours, and while it sat, I switched my attention to getting all of the leg components into the clamps as well. When that was done, I could take the tabletop out of the clamps and cut it to size using my track saw. Honestly, this tool is so versatile, I use it on every single one of my builds. Then, once it was cut to size, I gave it a quick, rough sand with 100 grit paper on both the top and the bottom. The base is going to be made from 2.5 inch by 2.5 inch solid walnut. To get this, I had earlier glued up a bunch of the offcuts from the 8-foot lengths from earlier. Once those were dry, I began milling them to the final stage by first face jointing one side, edge jointing, planing, and ripping them to final width. Once that was done, I called it a day. The next day, I start by cutting one side of each of the base pieces on the table saw using my miter gauge to make sure that one end was perfectly square. When that was done, I used a stop block on my fence to make sure that each of the vertical leg pieces were going to be cut to the exact same length. Then, for the 4 pieces that attach the legs to the stretchers, I marked and cut a 45-degree angle on the miter saw. My next step was that I needed to cut the lap joints that I'll be using to secure the vertical leg piece to the horizontal that connects to the middle stretcher. To do this, I took 2 pieces of scrap that I had cut off earlier and measured halfway on each. Then, set the dado stack on my table saw to that height and made some test cuts until they fit perfectly together. Then, I could finally cut the lap joints on all 4 legs and horizontal pieces and laid everything out on top of the table to make sure it was going to fit and everything was a perfect 9. To glue the 2 mitered horizontal sections to the middle stretcher of the base, I went back to the old trusty domino and added 4 dominoes per joint. Again, this could be achieved with a dowel jig, etc., but this really speeds up time. To clamp it all together, I used 2 offcuts from earlier 45-degree cuts and double-sided carpet tape to temporarily adhere them to the pieces. This allows enough clamping pressure across those joints and dealing with the weird angle. Were applied, I figured I would glue up the vertical pieces of the legs as well. So I applied a liberal amount of glue to the lap joints and then clamped all of those together, checking for square as I went around the base. To attach the tabletop to the base, I needed to add these caps to the posts of the base. Because the cap was much thinner than the actual post, I needed to cut a mortise down into the post much further than into the cap. So down, I plunged 28 millimeters. And then into the cap, I plunged 12 millimeters. This left me with a perfect 40 millimeter hole that I could fit a 6 millimeter by 40 millimeter domino into. While the caps dried, I tried to sand as much of the base as I could, and then switched my attention back to the tabletop. I added a slight 1/8 inch round over to both the top and the bottom of the table, just to break any sharp edge, and then started the long process of sanding through the grits. After 180, I water popped and then continued on with my final grit of 240. When everything was dry and sanded, I took the base and flipped it over onto the bottom of the table for the first time. Then, I marked the center of each of the holes that I had drilled into the cap and got ready to drill into the tabletop for threaded inserts. The holes in the caps were about 1/4 inch wider than needed to allow for seasonal movement of the top. I like to coat my inserts with a little bit of paste wax to help them go down into the holes a lot easier, making sure that the threads don't break. Finally, with all of that done, it was ready for finish. For this, I used the oil-modified, water-based poly from Minwax and sprayed it on with my Fuji Spray Semi-Pro 2. I'm so happy with the way that this table came out. Classy, strong, and elegant. Hopefully, it will be used a ton by their family. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll catch you soon with my next video.